I want to go through the topic of war with you and bioethics, and a bit also talk, also because it's the first lecture, I put some thoughts in about just what bioethics is, because it's also necessary to understand that if we're going to relate it to the situation of war and the role of bioethics in war as well. So I'll share my screen with you. I apologize for that. That's not pleasant to watch somebody else go through their slides, but there we go. Okay, let me just try to get things right. You can interrupt me anytime. You don't have to raise your hand or anything. You can just interrupt me and say something. I'll be very happy if you do that. And otherwise, I'll interrupt me and get back to you as well. But also use the chat. Put your thoughts in the chat. Put your thoughts on paper too, because don't try to keep your thoughts, because they're very important here as well. So I'm going to look at the role of bioethics in war and the role of war in developing bioethics. I think these two things are related. In fact, I think that war and bioethics have an intimate relationship, much more than we're often aware in bioethics. And I think it's important that we think about that too. But I think it's also important for us to think about what our role is as bioethicists, or those people who are interested in studying bioethics, those people who are applying bioethics in the great world around them, and what our role is with regard to this kind of these kinds of geopolitical conflict situations that shouldn't be there, I suppose, but are there and will always be there. So this is not so important. This is some background about me, but I went through who I am, so I'll skip these things here as well. I'll come back to this too, but it's unfair to say in a way that bioethics started with the Nuremberg trial, or let's say with the situation around World War II. It's probably unfair to say it. It's also probably perfectly correct to say it as well. So it's a complex situation, but it is the Nuremberg Code that gave us the first international code that we eventually would refer to for bioethics. And as you know, Nuremberg was a trial. And I'll come back to more about that trial later. But it was a doctor's trial. So some of you have discussed what the role of a doctor is and why a doctor's here. And these doctors were put on trial for committing war crimes. But the war crimes they committed were not crimes that they committed on the battlefield, but crimes they committed really in their experimental situations where they experimented on human beings in captivity with what they thought were scientific questions, but without regard for the persons on whom they were experimenting. So they were called war crimes, but there were also crimes of conspiracy, crimes against humanity, crimes in a criminal organization. Basically, whatever the prosecutors could bring and lay before them. These were preceded, in fact, by both the guidelines for human experimentation in Germany from 1931, which were in effect throughout the period of the war. And before that, probably the very first guideline where we see consent. And both the guidelines for human experimentation and the Berlin Code from the Prussian government of 1900 really have to do with consent, as does the Nuremberg Code as well. Consent is a key, perhaps the most important concept inside of bioethics with regard to human experimentation. but one we won't go into today here. The principal authors really had 6 points on ethical and non-ethical medical research that they introduced into the trial that eventually led to the Nuremberg Code, which is 10 points there. This is an interesting statement from Andrew Ivy to Maurice Buckerworth. In a letter he wrote in 1966 with regard to the trial. He said, "I might add that I accepted the invitation to serve at the Nuremberg trials only because I had in mind the objective of placing in an international judicial decision the conditions under which human beings may serve as subjects in an experimental situation, so that these conditions would become international common law." So again, for our colleague from Florida, forget your name, I always forget names, but it's about law. You're going to see more about this. There's a strong relationship between ethics and law. And what was happening here in Nuremberg was, in a certain sense, trying to understand what human experimentation is and what makes human experimentation justifiable. So the question always has been, with regard to human experimentation, is what makes it justifiable? And that's why I refer to consent, because from the Prussian code to the German law to Nuremberg, the Nuremberg Code, to the Declaration of Helsinki, to the Belmont Report, to the GDPR, the General Directive on Data Protections here in Europe now from 2016, it's always been consent. Consent is what allows us to experiment on other human beings. In other words, we're allowed to experiment on other human beings because they say it's okay for us to do it. They allow it. It's very weak. It's hardly satisfying, I would say, but it's the only justification we have. We have added one other thing to that since, let's say, really the early 1970s or even in the 1960s, and that is we have added IRBs, or ethics review, to it. Research ethics committees in the UK or ethics committees in Europe. We've added that to it since then. But basically, the real justification we've given, and the only justification we've ever been able to give, is that it's okay to experiment on someone because they say it's okay to experiment on them. We do the same thing now with regard to data. It's okay for you to use my personal data because I said it's okay. Okay, and we all say it's okay about 20 or 40 or 50 times a day. Every time we open a new website and we want to use the website, we click I consent without reading. Well, you read the terms of reference. I don't read them. I just consent. Okay. But here, what's going on here with Ivy and Poppenworth is they're trying to understand what this trial was really about. And Ivy says very interestingly, otherwise I would have had nothing to do with the nasty, obnoxious business. I believe in prevention, not in punitive cure. The judges and I were determined that something of a preventive nature had to come out of the Nuremberg trial of medical atrocities. They were medical atrocities. Question is, did they end in Nuremberg? So the aim of the code was to define permissible medical experiments. And consent was the foundation for it. Consent was also what was included was the idea of sound science avoidance of suffering and damage. That's what our IRBs and ethics committees do today. And risk versus humanitarian importance. Come back to that too, because we experiment on human beings because we believe there's something greater, something more important in the experiment than the experiment itself, let's say. Here. So what we say was that they found that from the evidence that in the medical experiments which have been proved, these 10 principles, which were more frequently honored in their breach, that means they were not honored than in their observance, and they came to these 10 conventions. Now, this is something I found a few years ago. Sev Flus, who passed away not so long ago, who was working at the WHO, shared this with me. This is a report from the advice of the Health Council in the Netherlands in 1955. He sent me a photocopy of it. It was in a PDF photocopy. It was a typed, can't believe it was just typed. And it's about 30 pages long. And it was, what happened was the Minister of Health asked this Health Council, made up of 15 men in 1955, to provide an advice on human experimentation to the minister in order to base laws around it. And this thing is about 30 pages long. And as I was reading it, it's only in Dutch, of course, and I was trying to figure out what they're talking about because they kept talking about the intervention and whether or not the intervention is acceptable or not. And then I came upon, finally I understood what they were saying, and this in relationship really to the Nuremberg Code and also in relation to the Declaration of Helsinki, which would come after this, but with where the Dutch would play a role as well. And the Health Council concluded that it is neither the scientific questioning nor the experimental character that serves as the basis of acceptability, but rather the intervention or intervention. And I couldn't understand why they would say this, because obviously it is the questioning, and especially it is the conduct of research, so the experimental character that's important. But they don't want that. Just as the people at Nuremberg didn't want to really put into question human experimentation, but they wanted to put into question, let's say, certain aspects of human experimentation, but without actually going to the fundamental problem, which is a problem we still haven't gone to yet. And we won't go to because we can't sort it out probably. But then I found this, and then I understood what they were saying. In all these sorts of interventions, the question arises, acceptable or not acceptable? And the committee has decided that it is its task to provide criteria for what's acceptable or what not acceptable. And here's what they come to. The Commission wishes to state, this is an amazing statement, with great emphasis, that the methods of the natural science are accepted as responsible and that they have demonstrated their value for science and humanity, especially in the last 50 years. Now think about this sentence. This sentence we could write today with the same emphasis and the same degree of belief. They require, thus, the methods of the natural sciences, which is exactly what is put into question when we question science. Let's say when we question the way medicines are developed. It's the methods really that we question at the end of the day. But here they say they require no defense to behoeven geen verdediging. That's amazing. But what these scientists are saying to the ministers, and you can listen to the COVID debates as well, they're saying to them is hands-off science. You cannot question the science, okay? You can question here if an intervention is acceptable or not, but you cannot question the science. We'll come back to this here because it's very important to our discussion on the relationship with war as well. So with the Declaration of Helsinki, we come to what I think is the cornerstone of research ethics, or the international touchstone for the ethical conduct of clinical research, as people have said there. What I think is important, I won't do it here, this is the introduction to the Declaration of Helsinki from when it was first agreed until it was revised, or till the end of 1996. So in 1996, there was a second revision of it, and this is before the 2000 revision. And this is what it says. It is the mission of the physician to safeguard the health of the people. Okay, now this paragraph is the most important paragraph in Helsinki, because this paragraph opened the original declaration in 1964. It was there, I believe, until 1996 as the introduction, as the first paragraph to it. And what it does is that this is the only paragraph really in Helsinki that does not discuss human experimentation, but what it discusses is the role of the physician. So those of you who are here wondering about the role of the physician, or you could even say today the role of the scientist, or the role of anyone who you're questioning what their kind of intervention might be in society, okay? The role of the physician is to safeguard the health of the people. His or her knowledge and conscience are dedicated to the fulfillment of this mission. This sentence is the most important sentence in bioethics. Absolutely the most important sentence in bioethics. Because this sentence discusses exactly what bioethics is about. And that's about the relationship between science, knowledge here, scientia or episteme, so knowledge, and conscience, which we can call ethics here. And the most important word in this sentence is the word "and." Why it's the most important word in this sentence? Because it's a coordinated conjunction, and coordinated conjunctions coordinate two grammatical elements that are equal. So knowledge and conscience, or if you want, knowledge and ethics are equal. There's no difference. So the goal, this states really not what human experimentation is about, but really what it should be about in a certain sense. And that is where there's no distinction at all between science and ethics, between medicine and ethics, between data privacy or data sharing and ethics, between data analysis and ethics, between AI and ethics. There's no distinction. They perfectly join, they perfectly meet with one another. That's what we want to achieve in bioethics. And that's why we want our scientists here with us as well, because that's also what they want to achieve. Where that something is good, both in terms of knowledge and what knowledge enacts in the world, and in terms of how that impacts on persons and society. That's what we want. Now, this sentence was changed from this 1996 to this when it was revised in 2000. It became then also paragraph 2. Huge mistake. Now it's paragraph 4. It should be the introduction, because this tells us everything we need to know about the physician, because remember, this is the World Medical Association, which is the association of national associations of physicians from around the world. So this is a directive or guideline that's intended for physicians from physicians. It's about their practice. It's about what they do. And here it says, it is the duty of the physician, not the mission anymore, duty, okay, to promote and safeguard. Big difference here, huge difference. From safeguard, only safeguard, to promote and safeguard. They had to add promote. I think they did because I suggested it at the time too, but they had to add it and they had to put it in the first place. You can't put it in the second place. You can't say it's the duty of the physician to safeguard the health of the people and promote the health of the people. That's the wrong order. Because the first thing you want to do is to promote health. So you want, the physician is not there just to treat illness, just to treat, let's say, the lack of health, but to advance health as well. We don't experiment on people because we want to prevent them from, because we want to safeguard them from something. That's not why we're doing the experiment. We're doing the experiment because the tools that we have in our toolkit, paragraph 6 of Helsinki today, the tools that we have in our toolkit are not sufficient. They're never sufficient. We can always do more to prevent sickness, to alleviate suffering. So we experiment in the first place to promote the health of the people. And while we're doing it, we also want to safeguard that health here. And again, this sentence here remains almost the same, except they recognize that there's another gender out there in the world. His or her knowledge and conscience are dedicated to the fulfillment of this duty. Again, the most important sentence that we have in bioethics. I'm going to stop for a second because otherwise it's going to be so boring for you. You'll all die here. And I won't be safeguarding, hardly promoting your health, but I just keep it going on. What do you think? What is the role of the physician? Because if we don't know the role of the physician, we can't understand the Nuremberg trial. We can't understand Helsinki. We can't understand the Belmont report. We can't understand a great deal of what bioethics is about today. I agree, bioethics is about more today than just the relationship between medicine and human dignity, or medicine and ethics. But at the core of this relationship, at the very beginning of this relationship, and we'll see this again soon, it's the relationship between the physician and the patient. And by the way, just keep one thing in mind too. It's patient singular, or research subject singular. Okay, and we'll come back to why that's the case today and why that's perhaps dissatisfying today. Okay, stop. It's time to stop being well behaved. What are your thoughts? Maggie, yeah.
When you said singular, I was thinking like every patient is different, even if they have the same condition, because each person has their own specifics to their identities, and it's important to treat someone as a person and not as their condition. Because it's like important to understand and consider their identity, like their cultural identity, especially. It's important that there's some cultural competency with the physician in order to promote and safeguard the health of the patient.
Well, you speak about identity of persons, which is very important for us to take into account, I guess, and to consider. as physicians or as just individuals, right? Engage with other individuals in the world, but you also speak of their cultural identity. So that seems to suggest that there's also such a thing as a group identity as well. Is that correct?
Yes.
And so we're going to ask ourselves, what's the relationship between, let's say, who I am as a person, as an individual, and the different kinds of groups that I identify with? Liza.
It could like mean what procedures or treatments you're comfortable with. For example, if you're if you are somebody who is a Jehovah's Witness, you might be on you might not want blood transfusions and stuff like that. Your identity is like more than like, oh, what your condition is, but what you allow to like happen, I guess.
Let me jump way ahead and ask this question. Would war be possible if we didn't have group identities? If group identity wasn't important to us, could we ever go to war? Liza.
No, not really. Now that you say it, because most wars or like conflicts that do happen between like groups that see themselves as different. Even if you're from the same country, different political views, you're going to clash. You're the same ethnicity, different like maybe like religions, you're going to clash. Like there needs to be a factor that differentiates you from one another.
We have that need. We have that need to identify ourselves with, but also against. I'm like this, but I'm like these people over here. I like basketball, right? But I don't like football. I don't like football. I like basketball. But those people play football, that's okay. They can play football, but that's not me. I prefer basketball, right? Or they live on one side of town, I live on the other side of town. Yeah, they do things one way on one side of town, we do it differently on this side of town. So this sense of identity is extremely important to not only who we are as individuals, but how we organize ourselves within society. And so, Kathy, I think that becomes also something relatively important for law as well.
Oh, definitely. And whenever you bring out two of the group identity, I think we're seeing that more and more, particularly in the United States, with the polarization, politicalization of things such as, I mean, the pandemic would probably be COVID outstands as to we've seen it. Group A is going to say, no, it was, overblown, embellished, it wasn't that bad, anti-vaxxing, et cetera, et cetera. And on the other side, very strong as to the need for vaccination, et cetera. And yes, the law intersects with that. And I made a comment, you said about the intersection of law and ethics, they're together, but yet there are so many times when you see the conflict between the law says A, but what is ethical, particularly into a medical field when the physician or healthcare provider is having to make a decision between what the law states you can or cannot do and what is ethical for the care of their patient.
I agree with you. I think it's one of the hardest questions there is to differentiate law from ethics. or to understand the relationship between law and ethics? I mean, I think it's a Socratic question. It goes back to Socrates for sure, but it's a tremendously difficult question to understand that. But but inside of law and inside of ethics are identities.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Wada.
Coming from Beirut, Talia Arawi taught me that what is legal is not always ethical, and what is ethical is not always legal. And this she has seen in her practice. Thank you.
That's a really hard question. You know, Socrates would say, you must obey the law. He goes even further. He says the law teaches. I mean, that is a fantastic, if you think about that, if you think about that as a way to understand law, that is a fantastic way to understand it. And to disobey the law, because normally we say, you know, we say to people, you have to follow the law, just like I have to follow the law. The law is there for everyone. We all have to follow the law. And we find that to be fundamental given in society, that the law defines, no matter where the law comes from, no matter how the law is defined in society, in any society, if it comes from the chief, or if it comes from the parliament, or if it comes from the dictator, we still say, you must follow the law. And this is fundamental for understanding war too, as well. Talia is here. Talia, one of your colleagues has just discussed the relationship between law and ethics and said that they are not, the law is not always ethical. That could be the case. But if the law is not always ethical, does that give us permission not to follow the law? And what are the consequences of not following the law?
Yeah, I think we're going to see that more and more again and I'm going to just use the example of in the United States in particular, going to the law in Idaho. Whenever Idaho did the complete ban on abortion, yet there was the issue, this is like where it's really compelling, the conflict between the physician who follows the law. Does that individual follow the law vis-a-vis Idaho ban on abortion, or follow the law as to EMTALA, which is, for those not in the States, essentially the law stating that if a hospital, if somebody arrives at the emergency room, the medical provider, the hospital is required to provide state treatment to stabilize. And there was a conflict in that. What if the physician is in the emergency room, a person presents, they're in a life-threatening or health-threatening condition that would require the stabilization would be to abort. If they did the procedure under the Idaho law as it existed, they would be, they could be charged with and convicted of a felony. The fact that it was done to save the life or the health of the individual would be a defense. It was not an exemption. Yet if they violated the law and to EMTALA, both the physician as well as the hospital could risk significant financial penalties. So it becomes, what law do you follow? And then you've got the ethical part of life-sustaining treatment. And at those times, if the individual chooses to follow what they believe to be ethical through the medical guidelines, the professional code, etc., they may very well run into the conflict where they're going to violate the law and be subject to criminal prosecution.
Okay, let's go a little bit further with the slide. Sorry to go back to the boring stuff, but we'll do that. And then we come back to this. I do agree that there's a difference between ethics and law, but actually separating them from one another is not always evident or easy to do. But it's a question, and it's a question that we need to pose ourselves as well. The other thing I just want us to keep with us is that the role of the physician is almost the benchmark for bioethics. Right? So it's how a physician behaves toward a patient. If you want an experimental subject, we call them sometimes today in a nice way, a research participant, but nonetheless, it's that fundamental relationship between a person who has or is seen to have the power to heal and a person who's seen to be in need of that kind of care situation. I think that's the fundamental relationship on which bioethics is built. So if we read here, see here, this is amazing, right? The word bioethics is first introduced into the world in 1970. 1970. I was 12 years old. I mean, this is not long ago. Bioethics is a young discipline. And bioethics comes from an American. And I've always said to my colleagues here in Europe, bioethics is an American discipline through and through. You can try to adapt it, but what you're doing is adopting it to European situations. And we're doing that around the world here today. Van Rensselaer Potter was an American biochemist. He was an oncologist and a bioethicist. He's from South Dakota. He's not from New York City. He's not from LA. He's from South Dakota. And interestingly, look at the prizes he won. He won the list of 10 outstanding young Americans in 1945. And then two prominent names come in from Pfizer Award for enzyme chemistry, leading to COVID vaccines eventually. Bristol Myers Squibb Awards. Bristol Myers Squibb is heavily involved with oncology, especially today, in 1981 here. This is where we come from with bioethics. What was the aim of bioethics? And I think that's the aim of it today too, still. It's an integration of biology with values, or in other ways you could say with ethics, to bring attention to the ethical implications of scientific advancements in biology and medicine. A bridge between the biological sciences and human values that advocates for the integration of ethical considerations into scientific and medical decision-making. Or it's how we approach ethical dilemmas in medicine, biotechnology, and the life sciences today. I think, and it's not really by chance that this happens in 1970, when we see an enormous rise in the power, if you want, of the life sciences, the power of these sciences to intervene in human life, to do good, but also in doing good or in advancing the good, also to do some things which have been rather terrible, to say the least. Okay. And but it's actually not just about the experimental situation. It's about the relationship between biology and human life, the biological sciences and human life, and now more and more biotechnology and human life. And today, I think it's increasingly about the relationship between the digital sciences, data and AI, and human life. And the real interest, I think the driving interest in science today is the relationship between the digital sciences and the biological sciences, and how this impacts, let's say, the ELSI considerations, the ethical, legal, and social impact of these on human life. Now, this is what I understand. This is how I try to phrase the history of bioethics. That it begins with a reaction to inhumane experimentations. These are experimentations, let's say, from Russia in 1889, to Germany, to the Nuremberg Code, to the, more than 20 years, 25 years that the World Medical Association took, or let's say, sorry, 15 years that the World Medical Association took to come to terms with what happened with the German doctors during World War II and produced the Declaration of Helsinki. With regard to the Belmont Report, the Tuskegee experimentations, what happened in the 1980s and then the 1990s when the radiation experimentations from the US government came out, where the US doctors said basically, well, Nuremberg was for bad people and good people didn't need to follow these rules. I've seen this discussed with good clinical practice as well, where people have said, well, during the 1990s to me, well, GCP, that's something for the pharmaceutical industry, but good people in academia, we don't need GCP. So this is, I think this framework of inhumane experimentations, I think it is very determinative for the principles that we have in bioethics and for the values that are expressed through bioethics. I know when I started working in bioethics, end-of-life care and euthanasia were huge topics that we were addressing at that time. Then the HIV/AIDS crisis came. The HIV/AIDS crisis actually led us into a kind of world really of a bit of groups and identities looking at global health disparities and looking at the question of access to medicines as well. These stay with us today, but it's really, I think they started very much with the discussions around HIV treatments and the world in which HIV people were living. Then we had stem cell research, embryonic stem cell research, where they asked a lot of questions. And not so long ago, we came into gene editing and cloning. And today it's with data ethics and with AI ethics. What would you add to this list? And it doesn't have to be something, you don't have to do something historical with it, but what would you say is important yourselves? What should be in that list that's not there? Halima, what would you say for you? What would be most important to have to look at from the perspective of ethics or bioethics with regard to the world that we live in today?
Yes, all that you have been mentioned is true of that, but maybe for addition of those you have been mentioned to, I have one thing which is ethical leadership, because we know that if we have all those things that we have been mentioned in terms of gene cloning, in terms of all the issues of global health, the end of life, it needs sometimes leadership. How do people, when they come across with all kind of ethical gaps, how do they make decisions in terms of leading others? For example, when you are talking about artificial intelligence ethics, now currently it's a very hectic and sounding issues in the global. So how do people make it? How do people use it? Though we have in healthcare facilities. For example, we have here in BMC, Bugando Medical Center in Mwanza, and we have an ICU, people who have been admitted. Sometimes they end up into brain dead, and sometimes patients, they are complaining of cost effective of staying with the patients for a long time. And at the same time, we need data for them and we need to care them as a human being. But how do people ethically leading others when they make decisions in terms of hospital ethical committee in the hospital base? That is what I think for.
Oh, that's a really important point. Yeah. And also, yeah, we've seen the rise of not only, let's say, research ethics, but also clinical ethics, hospital ethics committees, as you mentioned there, and also the role of ethics in leadership, the role of ethics in corporate affairs. Microsoft would have an ethics committee, or IBM would have an ethics committee, or Google would have an ethics committee. These are new phenomena. Well done.
Yes, I would say the ethics of dealing with vulnerable communities or individuals. They can be vulnerable through war, they could be in occupied areas, immigrants, migrants, children, underprivileged, etc. Thank you.
That goes back to something we were talking about before too, huh? That, because that's the relationship between individuals and groups, right? When we talk about vulnerable communities or vulnerable populations, we always talk about a group.
Right. But there are also, yeah, as a group, the group of the elderly, the group of incapacitated, things like that. Yeah. Well, yes, we're talking about groups, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. But there's also something else I think, Wada, that's we should keep, well, for me, that's important anyway, is that it's the vulnerability of each individual person as well.
Exactly.
That
yes.
each person is vulnerable. And I think the fundamental vulnerability is not our physical or even our social vulnerability. It's the vulnerability of our dignity. The fact that and this is the fundamental, I believe, I can't argue it here now, but it's the fundamental concern of bioethics too, is that dignity of the person. So it's not only that in an experiment you violate or might violate, let's say, the health of the person, or you might injure the person physically or mentally even, or something. But it's that fundamental idea of respect for that dignity of the person, and that each of us is fundamentally vulnerable there. And that vulnerability now can also extend to the fact that I'm also part of a group. That also makes me, let's say, vulnerable, more vulnerable, or vulnerable in different ways.
I absolutely agree with you. Every individual is vulnerable, and the dignity, the human dignity, And this is very important, and this is what actually differentiates a physician healer from a physician technician, actually. And the physician healer, the ethical physician is one who inspires trust, is humane, and has an excellent physician-patient relationship, which is based on respecting the dignity of the person, of course. Thank you. Over.
No, thank you, Oda. That's very important. Yeah. Yeah. Mamuna.
I think there should be a bigger focus on reproductive rights when it comes to ethics, and like, for example, the use of surrogacy, or when like a pregnant woman is declared brain dead, do you like carry that baby to term by keeping her on a life support, even in terms of abortion? And I think that there's a lack of resources for women that have various like reproductive health issues, for example, PCOS or endometriosis. I think it's very important to not only raise awareness, but also create public health programs, which is kind of aimed to not only like, fix them biologically, but also help them on a social aspect.
Yeah. That's really important. Person's body. You know? In this case, you refer specifically to women, but yeah, I remember I was in Douala in Cameroon once with the president of the French Medical Association, and we had a bunch of medical students, and we were talking to them about bioethics, and he said something that stayed with me for a long time. He talked about the privilege, in a certain sense, the confidence that a physician had with another person's body, the kind of intimacy that was allowed for a physician with the body of another person, that's in no other place or no other way is that allowed. The physician has this kind of prerogative, not prerogative, but confidentiality with another person that no other, that we don't see anywhere else really. And did I, Amuna, I think I messed up what you wanted to say. You want to say it again? No.
No, I was just like talking about like the need to kind of like focus on creating public health efforts to help women that are dealing with other reproductive issues. And I think there's also a big controversy around fertility, as well as just like the autonomy of making decisions when it comes to like, what you want to do with your body. And I think there's just a lot of social aspects that kind of play into it, like, the choice of not wanting a baby versus not being able to have a baby. To the world, it looks like, okay, she's not going to have kids. But, it essentially boils down to not your physicality, but also your like choice. Like, a lot of women really have to battle between having a career that they want versus raising a family, which isn't something that men immediately have to think about. Whereas a woman's body is kind of like, a ticking time clock.
Good, good. So bioethics really deals with some of the most intimate things in our lives, the most important things in our lives, fertility being one of them, having children, not having children, how we make decisions about our own bodies, and how other people approach us also from the view on our bodies as well. Anjali.
This is a little bit unrelated in that it's bringing up another issue, but I think that one thing that has been really interesting for me as someone who was quite young when COVID began and when the pandemic was, coming into fruition is sort of this intersection between balancing respect for the common welfare and the common good, and then also, respecting individual autonomy. And that in our current political climate, and especially during the pandemic, there was a lot of polarization. There was one side that was very much against, getting vaccinated, wearing masks, and those kinds of things. And they very much argue, well, it's our right, we have the right to choose what actions we're taking and what individual autonomy we have. But at the same time, there's also the knowledge that this can potentially be bringing harm to other citizens and members of society, especially those in a vulnerable position, whether it's having an autoimmune disease, being older, having, being prone to respiratory or heart disease or anything like that. And I think that I don't know what the answer is, but it's very difficult to find the balance between, respecting an individual's right to make their own choices, but also respecting the common good and the common welfare, and not putting others at risk by making those choices.
Yeah, Jelly, I think that's a really good point. That goes back to what we were discussing a bit before too, about the relationship between law and ethics, or in this case, the relationship between the individual and the group. In this case, to what extent can you put boundaries on the freedom of an individual? And to what extent, as an individual, are you required to respect those boundaries? And of course, what the law does is the law imposes boundaries on all of us. It always says, normally, especially in Europe here, it says what you cannot do. It doesn't tell you what you can do. It tells you can park anywhere you want, except where there's a sign that says you cannot park there. But otherwise, you can put your car anywhere you want. Or you can drive anywhere on the road you want, but you can't cross the line. So, and that's what Wittgenstein would say too. That's really, in a certain sense, he called that ethics as well. He said, he described ethics as being more or less that boundary, those boundary lines within which limit our freedom in a certain sense. Yeah. Let me just try to go a little bit further, just to bore you with all these slides here. So what happens? This is Nuremberg. And it's really important to situate Nuremberg, not only with regard to bioethics, not only with regard to human experimentation, but also, I think, also with regard to society as a whole and this legal situation. So what happened at the end of World War II? Well, we know what happened. The Germans lost. England, United Kingdom, France, the Russians, and the Americans won the war. Who prosecuted the German doctors? The US, the French, United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union. They prosecuted the doctors. 1945, Eleanor Roosevelt goes to San Francisco. They establish the San Francisco Conference, the United Nations. It replaces the League of Nations, right? They then come up with the UN Declaration on Human Rights. It looks very much like the American Bill of Rights, the French Constitution, okay? They set up the UN, and at the head of the UN, in the Security Council, they put the United States, Britain, France, and the former Soviet Union, and they put China. In fact, they put Taiwan to begin with. In 1971, they changed it. So we come to a new world order. And that world order, which Nuremberg is part of, it's not separate from this, it's part of this, is the world order that reigns today. And that order is the outcome of a war. It's the outcome of a war. So the rules-based international order that you'll hear talked about in the news and talked about in terms of geopolitics is based on, not necessarily, but based on at least some interpretations of the role of the UN and the role of these most powerful, all of whom become nuclear powers within the world today. And bioethics is, I think, a part of this. It's a part of this here. So I'm gonna stop this. I'm gonna ask you first. This is what I wanted to ask you. Really, what is war? How would you define war? Abdurrahman, how would you define war?
Well, I would define that as a conflict between at least two parties. That conflict could be violent, mostly violent. It started as a conflict between two parties.
And normally it's in terms of politics, right? Not necessarily, but normally it's between political entities, right? Phil, how would you define war? I think you need to unmute, Phil, sorry.
It is armed conflict between nations or parties of nations, civil wars, and maybe say some the group of the societies. Yeah, like that.
But does it have to be between? Can you have a war between two people?
Two people.
Cain and Abel,
Yeah,
was that a war?
That it is a can call a conflict, of exchange some words, not really at the as war.
Ariana, how would you define war? I think you're muted, Ariana. Bottom left-hand corner.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, please.
I was just saying, war is where there's armed conflict between two different nations or groups, usually political or religious, usually large-scale military engagements.
What are the rules of war?
The rules of war, I know that there's gonna be destruction of property. Big groups of populations will be displaced. There'll be displacement of populations. There'll be big social and economic impacts. I guess the rules would just be to create as much devastation between two nations or groups of people as possible.
I think you forgot killing people.
Yeah, that's right.
Might be the most important aspect of war. All right. You really want to kill your enemy. In fact, very often in war, you don't even name your enemy. You just call your enemy. Because to name your enemy is to give them too much life, too much credit. Tala Kansa, I think you joined us a little bit later. How would you describe war? Or Amon, how would you describe war?
Yeah, war is a conflict between two entities because of political, religious, economic issues that cannot be resolved in a peaceful way. And war usually results in killing of people, unhumane activities, something like that.
So one political philosopher, Hobbes, defined it as a state of nature. I would describe it as a complete breakdown of law, or the sacrifice of human life for other objectives in a state of chaos. I would say that war is probably something almost indescribable, because the only thing you want to do when you're at war with somebody is the only thing you want to do really is to kill them. And you have to kill them because the only thing that is more important is remaining alive yourself. And I think war is prosecuted because we believe that there are other objectives that are more valuable than human life. What objectives would you define as being more valuable than human life? Faisal.
Your question made me think of the Cold War, where the political, like, the two sides of the Cold War never really directly like fought each other, but they fought in proxy, and they had this political like one had to win over the other, that sort of political, and that's where we see the space race and all of these things come in, which oftentimes, like, yes, they were like deadly, because, like, you would have persecution of people, and also like all through the proxy like violence that happened, but a lot of it was like ideological differences, I suppose. Would you say that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, if you every if you look at like World War I or World War II, the Allies would describe themselves as, defending civilization against the barbarians. And it would be the same way the other way around. The Germans would describe themselves as defending civilization against barbarians. This goes back to the Greeks. This is always true. The only way you can really kill somebody or go to war with somebody is if you think you're better than them. You can't do it if you believe you're equal, or certainly can't do it if you think they're better than you. All right? You can't go to war with somebody if you think they're right and you're wrong. They have to be wrong for you to go to war with them. They absolutely have to be wrong, because you're going to kill them. You're going to destroy them. Maggie.
I just had a quick thought about like that Hobbes state of nature that you mentioned, because like I feel like a lot of descriptions of the immune system are like an example of war, or they describe it as a battleground, like with the killer T cells and everything. Like there's a lot of literature about this, and it's interesting that the number one choice is war to describe like your cells inside your body just doing their normal functions, because it kind of just displays how natural and significant war is to society.
Say something more about that, Maggie.
Well, I feel like I learned a lot about this in this summer course I just did, and like I read a bunch of articles on the repercussions of using metaphors of war to describe the body, because it's kind of like describing your body as attacking, it's like attacking itself when it's not supposed to. I don't know, it might be confusing, and using that language, especially for little kids learning about the immune system, might be kind of a little vulgar for younger minds.
But health, then you could say, is a state of equilibrium or peace in the body when things are regulated. Cancer is a kind of chaos. Huh? It's a kind of unregulated behavior of cells. Whereas we need the regulation. So what is the role of bioethics vis-a-vis war? What should we as bioethicists do? When confronted with war? What is our, I mean, you don't have to choose, of course, as a bioethicist, you don't have to choose to engage the topic of war. And I think we see many bioethicists not wanting to engage that topic, or many institutions in bioethics today not wanting to engage that topic. But what role should ethics have in a place where law has been completely abandoned? There is no law in war. I mean, that's the definition of war. There is no law. There are no boundaries. None. Zero. So, Kathy, as a lawyer, where do we situate ourselves as bioethicists vis-a-vis a situation where there's no war? Is there room for ethics then?
Well, I think that would look at it, and part of course, into the issue of war crimes, etc. You know, if you want to go into that realm. But I think that, well, that's a tough one. And it's not actually my area of practice at all. But if you're looking from that perspective, I think that there is an aspect we can play. Are we still looking at from the realm of providing assistance and services, such as to the hospitals, to the medical providers and their impact, and to total deprivation of the very basic fundamental needs as far as food, water, during the wars, if it is in an extreme weather, be it extreme heat, extreme cold, providing a comfort level to that. But you know, you're into a very difficult area, but I would still go with the idea also as emphasis supporting the focus as to the prevention and ultimate prosecution of war crimes.
What's a war crime?
I think we saw that rise back to the initial from Nuremberg as to the experimentation that took place during that, looking at into more current into the Ukrainian situation and to the war in the Ukraine as to some of the crimes that are being committed as far as and I would take them as crimes, you know, as to the attacks on civilian to hospitals. And there have been, in the program I'm in Loyola, we had a group of students who started before the invasion, who were from the Ukraine, who were going through the doctorate program at Loyola. And there was a lot of their input, et cetera, as to their role as providers and how that their hospitals had been attacked, et cetera. You know, it's pretty compelling when you're hearing from the personal story of the individuals who were there, who were living through it, who were unable to even get into the hospital to provide care because of the ongoing invasion.
Well, there's one last slide, and then I'll go to Dr. Talia if she would help us. Let's see here. 1 second. Let me just.
Hello, Dr. Francis. Please do call me Talia.
Thank you, Talia. You've asked me that before too. No.
Yes.
So I tried to behave myself. Yeah, but just want to go to one last slide and just share a screen here, just to make some statements here, some things here. So how can we understand really bioethics after this? And this is just really your first discussion within this fantastic program you're participating in. Talia is going to end the program, so I think it's really good if she would say something here at the beginning as well. But I want to say that firstly, bioethics is multidisciplinary, and that's what all of you are showing to us today too. It's all kinds of backgrounds, all kinds of people coming together, looking at what's most valuable and most important to us as human beings, and relating it to those things around us, those activities, technologies, medicine, experimentation, relationships with other people that are most important to us. And ultimately, the boundaries and the impacts, I think, of bioethics are determined by the public itself, by the places in which we live and the people around us. It's not a privileged domain. It's a continually evolving discussion. And I think it's really a very young domain. A few weeks ago, I had a discussion with a number of people about presenting a project to the Council of International Organizations of Medical Sciences to look at ethics in crisis situations. And many people were saying, well, the principles of bioethics are settled. We don't need to discuss those. Let's discuss good clinical practice guidelines. I'm not sure that the principles are settled. I'm not sure that many people in the world would consider that the principles of bioethics are settled. And I think we have more to do to reflect on that. I think these principles are really moments that somehow help us to fix the discussion, that give us reference points within the discussion, but they don't determine the discussion. And I think as you go through the week, you'll see a lot of these reference points, like the Declaration of Helsinki, the Nuremberg Code that we discussed today. But I think they're reference points. I think the places where we should reflect ourselves on what they are and what they mean and how they, let's say, impact the lives that we have today. And really, bioethics, and I think that's why you're here in this course, it's about engaging a discussion on the boundaries of human activity, on what is permissible, what's allowable, not just by the law, as we've been discussing, but what's permissible or allowable with regard to the face of the other, with regard to other human beings. So those are my thoughts. Talia, if you could give us a few words of wisdom, you would help me out a lot.
Well, I have to begin by admitting that I'm learning from you, Francis. So I'm not sure how am I going to help you, but I'm happy to chime in when it comes to war and bioethics, if I think I actually didn't miss the question. But there was, Diana noted that it seems to her that bioethics and war are somehow an oxymoron, which is something that one would think about. But the main issue is that with war, we are talking also disasters and major health consequences, particularly if the ecology of war, if the place where the war is being held has already a very poor infrastructure when it comes to sanitation, fuel, power, medication, etc. So this pushes or makes physicians face a plethora of ethical dilemmas. How are they going to choose which patient to treat first when we talk about triaging, for example? Which principle trumps the other? And at times, particularly when we talk about war in areas, for example, that have very low income, so the Global South in particular, and where there's a dearth of healthcare workers who often leave to be able to work and have a decent living, we find ourselves forced perhaps to bend what we consider holy protocols when it comes to medicine. So it's not always a specialized surgeon that would do X surgery, it's whoever is available, because the main principle is to save life. So there are a plethora of issues. And as you noted earlier on, Francis, AI is a big issue now, particularly when it comes to war. And to announce, I think someone also noted in the chat that war is when two countries are fighting each other, but there are also different kinds of war, economic war, psychological war. So, and all this pertains to global health. And when we talk about global health of climate change, we definitely have to talk about bioethics. So that's my, my 2 cents. And I hope I did not digress.
No, you did not digress, I believe. I think everyone would agree too. I think you take us further. I think you also, it's really good that, thank you, Talia, for coming in here. And I think you point also out to what we can look forward to with you later this week, but also throughout the week with all of the participants here and all of the instructors or lecturers that will come to talk to our group here. I think it's really important. I want to thank Halima because she put a really nice question in the chat, and she asked, how can we join an association, I think, or so. Halima, do you want to express it, please? I think you need to unmute, Halima. Otherwise, it'll be a big secret.
Yeah, it's rare because we know that the bioethics it's a new discipline. And it's a multidisciplinary field whereby, for example, here in Tanzania, it's a new, almost from Muhimbili National University Hospital. It's only one hospital that have been taught bioethics, and almost this is the 3rd past graduates. And we all really needed to be known by the government, by the regulatory body authority and the higher level link in the country and even in the global. So how do we reach on the point that those have been bioethicist professions who have been graduated to be known and work? Because I know these people, they are very important. And even when you come up closely looking on a hospital beds, in the hospital ethical committee, people, they don't know even bioethics people, they are there. So how do we reach on the point whereby we can launch these people known by the, how do their applicability doing to have an impact in the hospital base or in the community? But the next thing is, how do we reach globally to be having an association like, for those who have been graduated, having those career of bioethics, how do we reach on the point knowing somebody here in Tanzania as Mwaisum and another one who is in UK to know that they have all kind of a joint association? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Halima. You should someday you should look for the name Professor Wen Kilama. He was a great man in from Tanzania for bioethics, and I think he's passed on. But I think he was really great. He taught me a lot in bioethics, and he did a lot for Africa in bioethics. And I said too for women especially. He was fantastic. So look him up and see where things have gone with his group and so forth. But also, really, all of you, I think, are really fortunate to have one another. And I think that's where you should start, to start with one another here in this group and to build these friendships over this week and build this confidence in one another. That's really going to be very valuable to you going forward. You people have been fantastic. You know so much. You're so rich in your experiences. I put my email in there too, and Professor Talia and others will be able to also contact you with other people. You have a fantastic group. You know, Dr. Alif, Professor Alif will be coming after, and she's just this super person, these super people that you have here. So, I mean, all week long, you have so many great people. But make your community, you know, start with where you are, start with the people with whom you are. And that means here with the group that Anna has brought together for us, but also the people within Tanzania or within your countries or within your towns and villages. That's the place to start, because it's a very human activity, bioethics, and that's how we have to be. Good. I think I keep you over time. I know you have another lecture coming up. It's going to be fantastic, absolutely fantastic. You're really fortunate to have Professor Akmaki coming to speak to you. She's really on the cutting edge of what's going on in bioethics, and you're going to have a great week. So thank you very much.